Today we have Professor Kelly Shannon, welcome. First, I would like to invite Cecilia Chu, Professor, to introduce Professor Kelly Shannon and give the opening remark.
Thank you so much, Haman, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited and happy to be introducing Professor Kelly Shannon, a distinguished scholar and also a good friend, whose work I have long admired for many, many years. Professor Shannon is a professor of urbanism at KU Leuven, Belgium. Her research focuses on the development of landscape urbanism in times of global warming and the development of strategies that work with water, vegetation, and topography. Together with Bruno de Mulder, her design research is grounded in a deep understanding of context, extensive fieldwork, knowledge building, and proposals developed in collaboration with a wide range of local experts. Just want to add a personal note here that I first met Kelly at the other university, HKU, back in 2019 when she delivered a keynote for the graduate student conference in architecture. Actually, one of the organizers of the conference here, Ting Wang, also that was through her that we invited Kelly to be the keynote. At that time, students were looking for a scholar who could bridge the different domains of knowledge and subfields of the built environment, while also demonstrating a firm commitment to environmental and social justice across teaching, research, and practice. And Kelly proved to be that person, the perfect choice. Her work, indeed, exemplifies the best of design research scholarship, using design as a rigorous and grounded tool to address some of the most important questions regarding ecological and social crises of our time. By combining long-term historical thinking, careful attentions to locality and materiality, and a very deep sensitivity to everyday life of communities. I think that is a very, very good models for us to learn from Kelly, and I very much look forward to learning from your lecture, which is titled Water and Forest Urbanisms, Learning from the Mekong Delta. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kelly Shannon.
So, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to hear me today, and I will do my best to live up to the wonderful introduction from Cecilia, far too generous. But also I would like to start by thanking Cecilia and the School of Architecture here and the entire lecture committee for the invitation and for actually already taking incredibly good care. I had a very nice conversation this morning also with Sam, so thank you very much for that. So the idea of my presentation is to take you through work that I've been developing for almost 30 years. So educated as an architect, I'm educated as an architect, and I've moved to urbanism, but very interested in landscape architecture. So not being a landscape architect, I kind of want to be, but having a base as an architect. Also, I'm American. It's not something anybody wants to, I think, admit these days. American, having had more of my adult life in Europe, but working in Asia, so kind of blurring quite a few boundaries. So what I want to take you through is some of my obsessions over the last 30 years and trying to synthesize some of that work. So with, as Cecilia introduced, with my colleague Bruno de Mulder, in addition to others that have come along the way, as even students here, Viviana Dauria, who's now a colleague, a professor, Janina Gosea, who's now a professor in Delft. In 2008, we worked on this term of water urbanism. So building on the kind of bigger umbrella of landscape urbanism, how to address the crisis of urbanism that, in my opinion, was too much based on monofunctional land use planning, but also to address a crisis in landscape architecture, which was too much about gardening, and to bring them together. And for us, knowing that water is, of course, an essential element, not only for human vitality, but also for urbanism itself. So trying to understand how water has guided historically and in contemporary times the way where we urbanize, where we don't urbanize, and how to do this. We then took this a little bit further. We had ambitions to make water urbanisms east, north, south, west, and we only got through east before our obsessions continued to shift, but staying more or less in the east, meaning eastern, the eastern part of the world, in Asia, Southeast Asia, China. Here, of course, on the cover is a project by Kong Jianyu, a long time, say, hero, friend, and you'll hear more about him in a little bit. And for us, more recently, we developed an idea of forest urbanism. So if on the one hand we say humankind's desire and proven history of living with water and the forces of water, the kind of flip side of that for us is very much the vegetal world, the world of forests, that they're basically inseparable, and you could say flip sides of a similar coin. So understanding how they're crucial and complementary ecologies, where forests are also about sponges, about clouds and rain producers, and that the world needs more trees. We know that we are in a biodiversity crisis, a crisis that includes a crisis of vegetal world. And so the notion here was also to look at how the vegetal structure of forests can frame and embed settlements. So bringing those two worlds together a little bit, we tried to develop how these two systems work hand in hand. So coming from water urbanism, and I think as Kong Jianyu has termed it here in China, sponge and sponge cities. So we knew a long time ago, we forgot, engineered forgetfulness of the importance of space for water, space for infiltration, slowing runoff, storing water, and now more than ever, we know we need to restore a lot of our broken ecologies. We need to heal our landscapes. But at the same time, we understand that water alone has to, of course, as part of an ecological system of soil and vegetation. So we started coming to the notion of, as I say, forest, and even the developments that are going in forest science and biology to mycelium, so the world that we're not seeing, the world underground, so how it's all an interconnected system, but it's very much something that can be regenerated. And so to begin to understand how we need to heal these systems, not only for us as humans, but also for the non-human species as well. So again, here I use, to me, a project, one of many projects, as I say, of Kong Jianyu, who we all know died far too soon. But he's left, I think, an incredible legacy not only for this part of the world, but for the disciplines. As being a real visionary. To me, this project, as many of his projects, really encompass the best of, say, bringing back forests in the city, understanding and gaining appreciations for water systems and how to balance these. In addition to his wonderful, say, academic and intellectual mind, I think he was just a very passionate and kind human. So again, building a little bit on kind of framing some of the work I want to show you. two other very important works that kind of build, well, many important works, but two that I think are very interesting in framing my understanding about water urbanism is one by Suma Jumsai. Suma Jumsai, if you don't know him, he's a kind of crazy in the good sense, crazy Thai architect who actually studied in Cambridge with, and his friends of Buckminster Fuller, kind of makes quite wacky architecture, but also a kind of philosopher at heart, I think. And he wrote this really interesting book in 1988 called, as you see, Naga, the Cultural Origins in Siam and the West Pacific. And he really talks about how the notion of water in this part of the world is very culturally embedded. It's not a generic concept, but it's related to particular myths, particular cosmologies. And for him, a lot of these stories and myths and past histories have a lot to do with environmental stewardship, which I think is, of course, very important. The other book for me that I think is very interesting as another form of inspiration is again by Kong Jian, is a book he wrote together with Mary Padua, which was The Art of Survival. And it's where he's looking at his own profession of landscape architecture and talking about how maybe it isn't looking back in history, looking back in practices about how stewardship comes from, I don't know, kind of ingenuity born of necessity. So how the working of the land, the water management came from knowing what is needed and knowing what works, what doesn't work. And that's what he said, we have to get away from this aesthetics only and start understanding, re-understanding what our ancestors did in terms of survival. So that brings me also, I think, to a very interesting term. So many people talk about TEK, T-E-K, so traditional ecological knowledge, and how that's very different than SEC, scientific ecological knowledge. But for me, this term is more nuanced. So it's IKSP. It was developed, if I'm not mistaken, in Indonesia. And so they talk about indigenous knowledge systems and practices. So it's understanding that knowledge generation comes from local practices. Again, this word stewardship pops up, very, very important. This kind of self-renewing notion of ecologies, very much working, of course, with the forces of nature. Soft engineering is something that maybe can be reconstituted and to again improve our biodiversity. So what I wanted to do, so for me, water urbanism is a little bit, say, older on the scene and known by many, many authors who write about this. And I wanted to just quickly go through a little bit of some principles, I think, of forest urbanism. So in this book is came out from Leuven University Press. It's all open source. It's all free PDF. And it came from a conference that, it was a 3-day conference. So one day was about design, one day was about policy, and one day was about science. So having foresters thinking, oh, we all agree we should use forests. We spoke such different languages. It was still a bit shocking. But in this book, we tried to bring in pieces of all of those things. And as the preface to this science, policy, and design projects, my colleague Bruno de Mulder and I wrote a kind of 20-point manifesto. So I want to just take you through 10 of the points. 20 is a bit too much, so I self-selected a few, just that you get a feel for what we mean by this. And so one is that the forests are incredibly important. I think we're rediscovering this, and that they, for me, the most important thing to take from this is that it's all about multiplicity. So a forest has to be multiplicity of species, vegetal and otherwise, and that they also can accommodate, again, multiplicities. So here is a mangrove forest reserve. This is in just outside the mega city in Vietnam of Ho Chi Minh City, or former Saigon. And of course, it's somewhat, say, a primal forest, but it's actually a regenerated forest. The Americans, during the war, bombed like crazy the vegetal system and killed the biology, but it's regrowing, it's regenerating itself, and starting to become a much more a forest of a multiplicity. So another important principle that Bruno and I wrote about is actually, if we think about it zooming out, that you could say there are three primary occupations on the Earth, on the terrestrial Earth. So we have forest. We know much of the world was covered by forests. We had forest and water, hence forest and water urbanism. And then as humans started to develop, of course, many forests were felled for agriculture. And at the same time, forests were felled for human inhabitation. So this kind of trialogue between forests, productive landscape, primarily agriculture, also including aquaculture, and urbanization. So we pose that we need to come back to a more constructive interplay instead of one either or. That we have to think of these three things in new formulas and new relations to one another. So that means it first and foremost gets rid of this notion of categorical zoning. So getting rid of mono anything, even in terms of the large categories of the surface of the Earth. So this is coming from fieldwork in the Mekong Delta. The Mekong Delta, I think very interestingly, like most geographical things, it doesn't care about administrative or even national boundaries. The Mekong Delta spans Vietnam and Cambodia. Most of the time, the Vietnamese say the Mekong Delta is ours. It's not true. It goes across boundaries. So this is a wonderful, I think, illustration of that interplay of the three systems. So of the forests and the naturally high elevated areas along the riverbanks, and then an area cultivated, of course, for agriculture, but the way settlement nestles in. So this is, say, in Cambodia. And in Vietnam, it's a little bit more, you could say, almost scientifically organized, where every square centimeter of the delta is calculated for profit, first by the Vietnamese colonists who took it from the Khmers, then the French colonists, and then now the Vietnamese government that is very carefully developing this system of how to balance this trialogue, as I would say, adding water as the link between them. So again, reducing from 20 points down to 10, I'm trying to choose maybe the 10 more important, although the other 10 are also interesting. For me, it goes back to this relationship that I introduced a little while earlier about the importance of the indigenous communities, and again how they have been and remain, and maybe they have a lot to teach us who are coming more from the world of academia, a little bit more top-down, but to understand again how to be stewards of ecologies, how to be stewards of systems where this has happened for generations. Here's a very interesting settlement, again from fieldwork in Cambodia on the Great Tunnel Sap Lake. So it's a community that relocates itself every year about 6 times. So they move in and out of the lake in relationship to the water flows. And they have a very interesting relationship not only to the lake and to fishing, which is the primary source. Fish is the primary source of protein for all of Cambodia, but also to the forest, to the flooded forest. And this kind of relationship is well, as you see, even some diesel floating. But for the most part, the way these communities live, they live quite lightly in the environment, in the sense of also working to take care of it. I think another important thing we know, and it's particularly strong, I think, throughout Asia, is a notion of sacred forest and sacred groves. So in many different, sometimes tied to religion, but sometimes simply tied to cultural foundations and cosmologies, we have this notion of sacredness that is linked very strongly to forests and contributes a lot to the taking care of them and to creating stories of how humans occupy their place in the world. Here is, again, field work. This is, so the Mekong Delta was once occupied by the Khmers entirely, so the community that's now, I could say, pushed into Cambodia. But there's remnants of Khmer culture and still some Khmer communities considered minorities in Vietnam. And the way you can see on the horizon when you're riding a motorbike, the Khmer community, is you see a forest, because their forest was always very, very important for the Khmer community. And here you see the Khmer Wat, or the temple, that is surrounded by the forest. Scientific forestry is something that's also becoming more and more, well, already in the 18th century in Germany, but continuing until today, where it's a whole world unto itself, and it keeps evolving. Here's again an example where we see forestry. The forests are almost as crop. There's plantations. So it's again not thinking of forest as an as-found biodiverse system, but really where the trees become crops. Another, I think, very interesting notion that I'm sure everybody knows from architectural history or urban history is the whole notion of garden cities and how garden cities work together with landscapes and with forests. But I think forest urbanism, to me, has the opportunity to go one step further than the garden city. So it's really a more radical way of to embed, to live within a forest system. Here again, another example in Vietnam, so where it's a combination of old forest remnants, but again, the forest as crop, but where the kind of homes and the settlements are really embedded within this forest frame. Here, a productive forest frame. Again, urban street trees, I think in this part of the world, more than many other places in our histories that we know of China and Vietnam as well, taken from China, is the importance of street trees, the importance of tree planting that had a lot to do with displays of power, etc. But that these histories of boulevards and street trees, we know now from studies of foresters that we need more of this urban forestry and street trees than ever before. As we also know, as so-called development proceeds, infrastructure trumps everything, and many street trees are being lost everywhere. Here again, from some archive work in, again, this is in streets and systems in Saigon, in former Ho Chi Minh City, former Saigon. The French were also, and during the colonial period, they were of course extremely extractive, but at the same time they were building a social infrastructure and also continued, you could say, the Asian tradition of street tree planting, of which the legacy lives on today. But again, this is from an English newspaper, a very, very interesting kind of news group called Saigoneer, about Saigon. And they're displaying, of course, how much protest also there is, against this kind of removal of these ancient large trees. Because also the foresters and the science tells us that large trees are much more, a tree isn't just a tree. tree species matter, and also very large, age-old trees are much more important for the environment than young trees. So urban forestry also, again, gaining something that's gaining, it's been a long part of urban history, but it's gaining more and more importance as time goes by, as we recognize how we should deal with climatic kind of shocks. And so the idea is to again look to, this is a social housing project, a really wonderful social housing project built during the American occupation of Vietnam. It was a housing project for journalists, but the magnificent thing about this is also the open space in terms of the tree planting. But of course, today we're in the world of spreadsheets and accounting and politicians also wanting to do good by counting. So we've come into a whole system of, you could say, accounting. And I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from this and a lot of, say, takeaways where we should be a little critical. Because as I said before, we understand trees aren't just trees. It's not always about quantity, but also about the quality. There's a wonderful American a professor who's now in the United States named Rosetta Elkin, who talks a lot about different trees and how we have to be careful of not just talking about the 1 million or the 1 billion tree planting campaigns, that sometimes the quantity is a little bit missing the point. I think this is very well understood and mapped by another unfortunate too early death of a wonderful landscape architect, in this case Richard Weller. Richard Weller was a very impassioned man from Australia who ended up living and working at the University of Pennsylvania. And he made a wonderful atlas that you can find online. It's called the Atlas for the End of the World. So a little bit kind of pessimistic, but mapping the world with great optimism. And in this case, he's trying to look at the amount of deforestation that's happened globally, but from these kinds of maps where he's mapped, you could say, a lot of the destruction, and he then projects forward at a global scale of how we can make new projects and new parks. So the last one I want to, the last point of these 10 before I go into some other learning from the Delta, is really about again, a kind of plea for a paradigm shift. So to try to go beyond land use planning, to go beyond separation of the human nature relationship, culture-nature relationship, and to redefine this as a system so that we understand how humans are embedded in nature, and nature being a vegetal world, a water world, and a multi-species world. So from this, it requires really new types and new morphologies. I think for me, a very inspirational, again, Asian architect is Ishigami, and the way Ishigami works at the scale of architecture, but also I think at the scale of studies. And for me, this is a really beautiful illustration where he calls it in a book of his called Another Scale of Architecture. So the drawing on the left are actually the tree trunks and then the tree canopy. And then he tried to design his office if it was in the forest. So the drawing on the right is the placement of the office in the forest. So kind of experimenting quite a lot and making some wonderful propositions of the relationship of architecture and forests. So from this, I want to now switch to the Mekong Delta. Mekong Delta here, I add the Saigon Dong Nai Delta. They're actually two separate deltas, but of course they're connected. So we, in our research, combine them. So here you see the two together, so the area that's in blue. So this kind of vast waterly world. The big area you see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the lake in the northwest. That's the Tanosap Lake. So this incredible lake in Cambodia that during the rainy season, it changes its direction, and the river linking to it reverses its flow direction, and the space in area is 10 times as large and 10-meter rise of the waters. So this area is, this is a 1970s map from the US intelligence, and it shows this kind of cultivated area. So the brown is a cultivated area, the blue are still marshlands, and the purple are mangroves. So of course the mangroves used to be massively taking over the territory. So already in the 70s, quite some years into the Second Indochine War, or as the Vietnamese would call it, the American War, or the Vietnam War, much of this mangrove system was destroyed. So what I want to take you through is an ongoing work. It's a work of Bruno and myself. It seems to be a never-ending work. We're writing a book. This is the title of the book that we're working on. It's the Mekong Delta, A World of Mud and People Passing By, looking backwards, 2,100 to 1,000 BCE. So this world of mud and passing by is actually a quote by Louis Mallaré, who is a French archaeologist. And he, in his archaeological work of the Mekong Delta, he said that the delta the world is nothing else but mud and people passing by. And so for us, it's interesting to understand how these traces sometimes stay, sometimes erode, sometimes remain in use, taken over by nature. So he was looking at the pre-Angkorian, so the great Khmer Angkor Wat. He was looking at the pre-Angkorian works, but that's how he described. So some of his drawings one of his drawings is on the left, and on the right, this kind of notion of the mud. So this book that we're working on has 3 major parts. The first part, you could say, is a more traditional historical review through 3 different lenses, through geology, through ecology, and through settlement over 3 different time periods. But it's about settling, and it's with archival work. The second part is this atlas, an atlas of the variations of ways of settling. So we've been, for the past 5 years, doing fieldwork by motorbike and by boat. And you'll see some of this. So it just keeps getting bigger because we kind of can't stop and like doing fieldwork. And then the third part is our design exercises. So looking back on our work, so about 12 projects, and trying to rethink what we did in light of the lenses that we're now looking. So I'll show you a few of those projects. But first to see this, oops, I went too fast. So this is, so we're spending a lot of time, of course, redrawing. For us, drawing and map making is a way to understand. So this orange line, it traces a 16-meter contour line. 16 meters, we kind of chose it as the delimitation of the delta by trying to read different things. And as we keep writing and reading and doing research, we understood that actually 16 meters was also used historically. So we kind of, well, lucky shot, or I don't know. So in this sense, we include the adjacent delta of Ho Chi Minh City. And we basically go upstream to this area, which is where a falls start. So this entire area, and again, this magnificent lake of the Tanosap. So in the first part, we're really working a lot of trying to kind of narrate a history of the environment and a history of the settlement within that environment by looking to archives, by trying to also, you know, the French were very good at part of the colonial project of mapping, but of course, who were they mapping for and what were they mapping? So trying to find the the stories before the colonial time is of course a challenge, but something we're trying to do by talking to local historians. So the delta today is often spoken about in Vietnamese terms or Cambodian terms, and even you saw the French were also drawing them a little bit separately, but of course we're trying to understand them as they work as a system. So for us, understanding this larger territory as an ecology, but also as a natural system and as a cultural system is also very important. So another concept for us that becomes super important is to understand that as humans, we like certainty. To live in a delta is precarious, is difficult. A delta is muddy, it's mucky, it's marshy, it's wet. And as humans, as architects, as engineers, we like clarity, we like lines. This is land, this is water. And we say, inspired by our colleague Dilip da Cunha, maybe, that maybe we should forget about these lines and start to embrace the mud, embrace the in-betweenness, embrace the uncertainty. So for us, this whole notion of the muddiness is something that we are very interested in. We just wrote something actually for the perspectives in architecture about mud. But at the time, mud was seen, and the swamp, draining the swamp, literally draining the marshlands, was the kind of story of the day. So the infrastructure wasn't highways at the time, but it was massive canals that required massive labor to dig the canals, to drain the swamp, to make it agricultural land. So there's quite a long history. Also, surely in the Pearl River Delta, other methods, but of similar natures of trying to engineer away the swamp, the quagmire, the mud. Here we're also seeing diagrams from the French. This is a handbook of rural engineering developed in the 1930s. And kind of showing how the sculpting of the mud, the sculpting of the territory, was what was going to make it, in this case, the rice basket of Vietnam, which would make it kind of a productive land. So for us, we became very, very impressed by this mud and how much it's part of the everyday life, the working of the mud, the rice culture, the sculpting of it, the kind of small ditches, the small dikes, the temporary dikes, but also how it's used, how it's been used and abused. In this case, again, this is actually coming from a man who wrote about how during the American War, again the Vietnam War, from 1955 to 75, also used the engineering of the mud as a tool of war and of defense. So the Americans really introduced these massive earth movers, these bulldozers, and of course destroying and leveling. And today the most pervasive engineering tool you see in the Mekong Delta is this bulldozer, earth mover. They're constantly shaping, reshaping. It's under constant reconstruction, and with all of these heaps and having to dredge always the canals because, of course, they fill with siltation. So this kind of massive amount of human work, machine work, to keep the delta in its engineered state is remaining. And of course, at the estuary mouths, we have the natural processes, but at the same time, we have, again, how to grow orchards in the water. You also needing very special systems of earth moving. But of course, for us, what's very interesting in this case, in the Vietnamese, this is in the Vietnamese part of the delta on the right, and on the left, the Khmer part of the delta. So the natural topographical elevations are very cleverly first taken by settlement and by, more importantly, perhaps in the cosmology is the places for the dead. So that this was something that was entire constellations of natural high grounds were taken for cemeteries. So in the work that we've been doing, looking at this larger territory, we try to understand it the way geologists and geographers understand it, which is through something called agroecological regions. So it's saying what the soil is, what the humidity is. So it's not what policymakers impose. On this land you shall plant that, but it's saying on this is what this place can and is constituted by. So it's divided naturally into different agroecological regions, and this becomes a base for us to understand how to proceed. So in this area, the biggest challenges are all these crises that we know we have, going from the political to the socioeconomic, cultural, and ecological, and the spatial. I mean, we often leave out the spatial as a crisis, but it's an absolute crisis, I think. And then trying to understand how to work with these things I spoke of before. So you can see maybe all of these little dots. These are places where we've been doing field work. So what we do is we go on we own a motorbike in Vietnam, and we spend a lot of time, more like what we should have done 4 years ago when we were youngsters, going around taking drones and photographs on the ground, and then looking for very different configurations of geometries of water, land, mud, and settlement, and trying to. So we have about 250 of these. These are 1.2 kilometer by 1.2 kilometer, and then we zoom in to get to the scale of architecture as well. And for us, again, this water, it's a really wonderful system when the floods come, because it's not, of course, there is some fear from the water, but more or less in this part of the world, the floods are welcomed. They're part of ceremonies, they're part of bringing fertility to the land. Okay, it's not always wonderful, but it's certainly always omnipresent. But what's happening now, as we know, is that the kind of permeability of the land is changing quite a lot. It's first and foremost with massive infrastructure. So it's losing its natural sponginess. It's also having a lot of kind of, I would say, very ill-considered in terms of placement, and even in terms of urbanism, new settlement systems. But at the same time, we still have some of these water markets and water systems that are there. But the area itself is the entire delta, and it's really suffering a lot, because what they do in Vietnam and Cambodia is to, again, turn wet land into land. They fill with 3 meters of sand. And this has been happening in gigantic territories. So guess what? Of course, there's a crisis of there's not enough sand. No, Vietnam is completely out of sand. Major construction projects are stopping. They've taken a lot of sand from Cambodia, trying to take from Laos, but now there's a big sand market. No, we have oil markets, but we also have sand markets. At the same time, the river itself, because Vietnam and Cambodia are downstream, but upstream, I have to say a lot in China, but also other places, building massive dams, changing the entire sedimentation, the entire flow system. So there's a lot of changes in that regard. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to make a way to understand the way to work by first having a series of design attitudes. And first and foremost is really to understand the local conditions. And then we have this notion of if we start to understand that humanity is living in nature, we're living in parks, that we can inhabit them intelligently. We can recalibrate this tripartite system, this trilogue of agriculture, forest, nature, and settlement, very much inspired by people like Ken Frampton and others who talk about kind of a critical regionalism as a way to resist globalization and kind of flattening through capitalist processes, and also climate responsive. Fitting into that is an idea, again, of this park. So if we say that from the 18th century to the 20th century, we developed parks all around the world, had a lot to do with social reform, but they were kind of universal models. And we're very critical of this universality and modeling. And so saying that the 21st century parks, they maybe start understanding more how we're part of nature. We can be inhabited, can be a neo-nature instead of a sacralism of nature, and really to emphasize locality. So for this, we take concepts coming, say more theoretical concepts coming from people like Bruno Latour, talking about the critical zone of the Earth. E.O. Wilson, I was actually talking with Sam about E.O. Wilson, he's an evolutionary biologist who said in order for us to continue to survive on Earth, half of the Earth should be without humans. So a very interesting proposition. Francis Halley, a botanist who recently died from France, who talks about restoration of primary forest. And then some designers. So Gilles Clement, talking about this notion of living in a planetary garden. Richard Weller, who I spoke about before, who made this atlas till the end of the world, and Kong Jianju. So from all of our work of about 12 projects from the last years, we've tried to, instead of in this third part of our book, we don't want to present project, but trying to distill them through looking back over time to some different themes. So these are the 4 themes that we come to, and we try to pull the different projects in different ways. So knowing that once you make categories, you're kind of trapped because nothing is easy categorized. It's much more nuanced, so they fit multiple categories. But the notion of sponge landscapes, recreating sponges, instilling forest urbanism, understanding that once we were a water-based system, we've moved to asphalt, major infrastructure, but maybe we can return back to water. And then this whole notion of developing new typologies and new dense systems. So I'll quickly run through a few projects. This is one that was our longest running project. This is our earliest project for the Vietnamese government, for the Ministry of Construction, in the center of the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. So a water system, so where you see the DNA of the city, this is the city of Can Tho, is really based on water. Even in this 1920 colonial map, still a lot of the marsh wasn't yet drained. So this, from here to here, is 60 kilometers, so it's a large city. And we developed a new master plan. We don't like master plans, but it's the only legal mechanism presently in the Vietnamese planning system. So our system was based first on beginning to create a water system. So a water system that dealt with quantity, so having space for flood, for retention, for drainage and irrigation, but also to purify. So the gray areas are industrial zones, so creating water systems that would purify the water on site before it's released into the landscape. In this sense, the profiles that we try to develop, infrastructure profiles, which they tend to create too big. So we said, okay, maybe create them big, that they can be downsized later, and always including public transports, tramways, but also including, say, in the urban areas, water and trees, but also when infrastructure goes more through an open landscape to include a cycle of water that works with the productivity. So for this project, it was very much about trying to balance cut and fill, trying to understand water as transport. And in this case, also the building typologies, we said all buildings should be 5 stories and below or 12 stories and above, because to build the foundations into the delta, to get to economic payoff, you have to go more vertical. And in the end, the plan this is a kind of small diagram of the plan, but the idea was that the urbanization is on these high, dry islands that are in white. This is an orchard forest, so much more money per hectare than rice fields. And then we took the most fertile lands, where the former master plan put a city here, and we said this should become a park, a park for the city, but a productive park, a scientific park, and so that we have all of the land that's not white can be flooded during the monsoon time. Another big project we work on, which for us was really challenging, we spent 5 years on it. We developed a 450-page report that was mostly drawings. Was a new plan for the Vietnamese part of the delta. So we looked at different areas and came to the idea that we could have different forms of urbanization. So in this area, which was the most lowland, we could have settlements that were on stilts. In the green area, the most productive, the most fertile, we would have the most density, and along the coast, which is more vulnerable, we would have less, a new kind of urbanization. So along the coast, for us, this is the plan we ended up developing. So we had water, keeping water upstream, having the coast replanted, revegetated, so a major project of afforestation, and then coming to some typologies that worked again with the notion of high, dry urbanization surrounded by multifaceted production. For this, we were really inspired by, this is again coming from our field work. So this is one of these 1.2 kilometer by 1.2 kilometer with a section, and what we do is we zoom in, you see, on 400 meters. So here we have a 400-meter section because we were very interested in this particular form of architecture. So this architecture is actually a particular kind of housing where they live on top of fish cages. And so for us, this, say, existing system would be inspirational for the way we would design a large reservoir upstream where we would have new forms of production in a place where we're collecting water. When we talk about forests, we also can talk about this same project. So again, looking at this larger piece of the Vietnamese portion of the delta, understanding its soil conditions. So again, trying to map what we're not seeing, but that's very determinant on what exists. Mapping also in a similar graphic the topography and the bathymetry, so the topography underwater, and putting them at the same colors. So when we showed this to the Vietnamese government, they were quite shocked to see, because usually the kind of intuition is that the coast is going to be the most flooded. No, it's actually the area next to Cambodia because it's actually lower topography. So it kind of changes perceptions by, and I think that's part of our ability as making drawings and maps to reveal logics. So here, again, this system, part of this notion of forest urbanism, we tried to bring back in a forceful way, on the one hand, the bright green are orchards, so fruit trees that are very, they give a lot of money to the farmer, much more than rice, but also reconstituting its mangroves. So having mangroves in a two-step that are first protective, but then a second line that is productive. So allowing shrimp farming that is happening, but to happen in the mangroves. And for here, we also learned a little bit from existing areas. So this is an existing area in the middle of the coastal area where they use a lot of wind energy in the reconstituting of mangroves. So we had the idea to bring back mangroves, big ways, king mangroves, and have clearings in the forest for floating settlement with energy production. We're also very inspired, again, another fieldwork, 1.2 kilometer, of a system where we have this very rich orchard system. So understanding how the housing lives together in a productive landscape. And for us, this was images that came from that project, where it's really trying to provoke the notion, getting away from single land use, where you can have an industrial area and the monkeys and the mangroves. It doesn't have to be either or, but where you can have this strong mixture. One more, this was a invited competition. We were the kind of underdogs, say with big corporate firms. We work together with the Vietnamese Institute of Architecture and Planning. So an area, what we see in the foreground is Saigon, and then the Saigon River and the Dong Nai River, the city is expanding to the east. So the idea was to make a plan for this. But the competition was set very strange because the government had already sold most of the land to private developers. So it was kind of fixing the planned mistake before it would happen. So what we did is we started to make drawings where we manipulated the digital elevation model. So this is how we found it in the competition. So the black area is Saigon today, and you see quite a lot existing in the area that was going to be newly urbanized. But this is the green is lower, the blue is the lowest land, the green is the next lowest, and then the colors. So if all of the development plans happened as usual, this is what you would get. And we said, no, let's stop the planning, no more land filling. We stop it at 2018, and we adapt the urbanization to the level of water, the level of sponginess that we have. So from what you see on top are the sections made by the development plans. And this is our new section. So we showed that you could have not less density, not less development, even more development than the developers wanted, but also more open space, more vegetation, and more water. So again, the proposal of developers, and then our new proposal where we have, so in these 3 waterways, we make more space for water, but we also make more space for, and how to do that, how to make the deals with developers that the local leaders would have to do. So we tried to come to kind of different land sharing, changing of development rights, trying to show that we could change the plans that they had to come to a new system. We also looked at the water system being for us the DNA of everything. And then we said, what if we develop this new infrastructure instead of being roads? So Vietnam, Saigon is developing a crazy, if you ask me, metro system that's costing tons of money, sponsored by JICA, the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, running over budget and overtime. So those are these big, the darker lines with, and we said in the orange lines, what if we developed, instead of a metro, we developed a wetro. So we took their logo and flipped it. And so we make a wetro, and we said it can work like Uber, or in the case of Vietnam, Grab, where we can have an app and where you can have a whole series of a fleet of boats. So if we're a group of 5 going out to dinner, you get a small boat. If you're a whole school, you take a big boat, and you have fixed stops, but you also have local spots. So we worked with our local the people from the Vietnamese Institute of Architecture and Planning, and they kind of worked on the more quantitative, trying to prove how much more efficient it would be economically. And the last project, I just show a few images. It was our first, and I would say only, and perhaps, hopefully not the last, but it was work with a private developer. It was a private developer, a woman. There's not many female private developers in Vietnam. This was one. She got her fortune in milk and in dairy products and was putting her money into real estate. So we said, okay, why not? Could be nice. She hired us and then fired us. We think we quit and she thinks she fired us. So it was a kind of mutual misunderstandings at a certain moment. But it was to develop a new satellite town for Ho Chi Minh City. So it's about 40 kilometers to the southwest of Saigon. And so the idea was to develop an urban area and then an area that was still very spongy. So we said, let's keep it like that and let's create some islands where we put universities, hospitals, and then an experimental farm. So still a little bit more land use division than we wanted, but so we worked on this for quite a while, and the only thing I want to show you here is actually the development of the most urban area. We were really pushing that it becomes a typology that's kind of interlocking roads. So what you see in white with the trees, with water. So it's everybody could come to their house by boat or by motorbike or car. So it was kind of trying to go back to the notion of water. So with that, I end. So for us, it's our ongoing work, which I hope to continue for a few more decades, to try to understand more and to do more. But it's really about trying to embrace the notion of mud, trying to understand that we have this system of gradients of wetness, that we don't have to be wet or dry, trying to understand the local indigenous traditions and how we cannot be nostalgic and not be romantic, but learn from them, and then how to create new systems. So I stopped with that. This was part of that competition, and we said for the government, for every new person you bring, why don't you also have a tree, and that the people take care of the tree. So when you're born, your parents plant a tree, and then you have to take care of that tree as a kind of new form of stewardship. I think it's something that is actually done in parts of China. I know in Singapore they're doing this. So thank you. I end there.
Thank you very much, Professor Shannon. Thank you for your amazing presentation. I think the research and as well as the design project. So now I think I would just open the floor for questions. If you have any question, please raise up your hand and our colleagues will pass the mic to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly. Today is a rainy day in Hong Kong. Thank you for coming in a wet day. 2 questions. In Hong Kong, we are going to have a large area development we call the Northern Metropolis. That is northern part of Hong Kong. Probably you may have heard about it. And in these days, people are talking about the concept called the NBS, the nature-based solution. So I would like to hear your view about this term NBS and how the audience here may learn from you about how to interpret that. Second is that since you are an American, I don't know whether you would like to comment on the current Trump, okay, and how is it related to climate change and how they are affecting our future. Thank you.
Both tough questions. I know, nature-based solution, I think it's, for me, yes, of course, why not? But at the same time, my slight hesitation with this terminology, and the fact that many people show it as kind of models, and even as like, well, we have now very beautiful drawings, either made by hand or made by who knows machines and AI. What of all different nature-based solution fixes? And I think, yeah, of course we should go back to, I don't think it's only nature-based solutions. We always have to have hard engineering. It's not either or, I think it's a combination. But my little hesitation of this nature-based solution kind of coming around as the answer, the solution, is that they're often taken as models, as one size fits all. And that if we have this kind of perfect system of a wetland, we plop it here, we plop it there, and it will just do a great job because it's an MBS by nature, or not by nature, but by default, it will work, no? And politicians can sell it, and it sounds good, and yeah, why not? A little bit political correctness, I think. But I think the challenge for designers is to take the good idea, why not? But to make it very embedded in the location, not only in terms of its geology, but also in terms of the culture. Because I think culture often gets, if we talk about landscape performance and landscape metrics, I mean, now we're a very metrically driven world, which I find difficult, because I think it's still about creating beauty and not just machines for performance, and that's why like, good architects, for me, remain ever inspirational, because we have to do the performance and nature-based solutions, but it has to be spectacularly beautiful and fitted to its context. Because I think we're now too much in a world where we have models and universal fits, which I think are they've given us the mess of the world we're in, if you ask me. And about Trump, well, he's part of it's very interesting. Of course, I'm a hardcore anti-Trump, as I think anybody I would like to associate is. So if you're pro-Trump, sorry. But I think in trying to understand that world is hard to understand, well, I spend a lot of time listening. I've just discovered podcasts. I'm a bit late to technology, but listening to a lot of news and listening to a lot of it's the phenomenon of this particular ways of thinking. It's not new. It's been 40, 50 years in coming. And I think for me, the hopefulness of us is that we're people who are projective. Many people in academia. I think education has a lot to do with changing worldviews. So I remain, despite frustrations in academia. I think that having discussions where you're challenging thoughts and having people learning how to think, I think part of the world's, well, this is a personal opinion, but in the US, for me, the part of the trouble is that the educational system has a bit failed. It's failed in producing people who challenge and who are thinking and reading enough. And I think then the results become, say, mad leaders, no? That are easy and kind of can speak the game of populist, whatever, but without this kind of capacity of critical thinking. So I think for us, that's where we're in a privileged position by being in the world of academia and the world of architecture, I think in particular, because I think architecture, I was talking this morning with Sam a little bit about this, how architects, I think, are at a very interesting threshold because we live in the world of, I mean, we design the real world, but we're also partially in the world of, hopefully, lost in the world of ideas, but also more and more straitjacketed by the world of technology. And I think that the clever architect who's critical thinker is able to negotiate these different kinds of intelligence. But I think for me, it's a make or break transition period for our fields of the built environment, because if AI can do all this stuff, why do you need us? I think you still need us. I mean, I would fight for the relevance of architecture. And don't forget, Trump came as one of the bad guys as a developer, no? He was part of the capitalist machine of just making money on architecture that was generic and having a model, a Trump hotel or a Trump whatever, that would solve the problem of the city. And now, so I think he's a horrible case study, but a super interesting one to understand the bigger issues. Well, could have a whole day's discussions on this, but yeah, thanks.
Hello, Kelly. Thank you very much for the very impressive presentation. And then I think it's actually relevant to a lot of us, both from research perspective and also as a teacher. I guess I'm especially impressed of like how that actually links to the design work, or actually what an architect could do. I guess we do have quite a few students around here, so I thought whether you can share a few words. I think particularly is actually how when we see that in design studio, sometimes we look at, because we need to push for the ultimate outcome, output actually, the build project, whether it's a public space or whether it's a building, and then how does that link that goes from the larger regional mapping, so from those maps, the things that it informs you, and then into like how it actually informs the design project, if you can share some of those insights with our students, yeah. Sure. Thank you.
Well, as I said, I'm educated as an architect, and I think I still am an architect, and I still want to be an architect. But for me, the world of architecture, the world of urbanism, and the world of landscape, to me, it's actually all architecture. I mean, I don't mean to sound pretentious when I say that, but I think, well, I mean, for me, architects like Shannon and Aalto, some of the Scandinavian, but they went from designing the environment to designing the doorknob, no? And to me, this is the world of architecture is constantly across the scales. I think when we've, at least also when I was educated in the US, in my 5-year Bachelor of Architecture, we were very much educated as architects, given a site with like a dotted line, and sometimes the buildings across the street would be on the site plan, sometimes not, no? And for me, as I studied architecture, to me it was, and then went to work, I worked in architect's office, it was kind of normal. And for me, a big shift came when I studied in the urbanism in the Netherlands. And again, all of my colleagues were architects. At the time, it was during the Yugoslav war, so they were half Croats and half Serbs. And we were, and their whole education was very different because they were much more, had a foundation in urbanism. For me, it threw me off course. I really had a lot to learn. But for me, this kind of going across the scales became necessary. So even to design a small building, to me, to understand its relationship to the bigger systems is now more than ever, we can't not do that, no? If we understand systems around us, every system, political, water, collapsing, or in crisis, so even at the scale of a one plot, to understand how it fits into, because I think great architecture alone isn't going to save the world. Unfortunately, it's going to make a few things nicer, experiences for hopefully more than a few possible. But it's this kind of system level thinking that I think is the shift. But to me, it's not different than architecture. So in that sense, also when we work in studios, we often have, I work in a postgraduate program where most of the students who come are architects. And then we start taking them to the level of looking at territories, and they're completely, we say, no, but just think of it as like a big building, no? I mean, well, it's just, it has corridors, it has systems, the same way a building, if you think of it in a term of a landscape. So it's, and then for us, for me, what makes a big difference in studio teaching, whether it's for a building or for a territory, is fieldwork. So for me, the kind of embedding and really trying to understand whether it's a certain plot and its micro topography, its system, but also the culture of what is wanted there and what it has been, because I think also the trouble we have as architects and designers, we think our moment in time is like the most important moment in time, but this notion of a site as a palimpsest and as kind of layered histories, some of which are traces and erased or still not seen, is really important. So for me, with studio, understanding past traces of sites, past histories, so looking in archival maps at the scale of also a plot is super important, because it can be not only informative, but it can be kind of foundational for creating new intuitions and new designs. So.
Hi, thank you so much for your super interesting talk, even though I couldn't be there the entire time. And I saw your projects, you discussed several projects in Vietnam. And I actually also worked in several projects in Vietnam on master plans. And we had some similar developments where we tried to respect against all odds the sort of histories of the landscape, histories of the people, histories of building culture, living culture, and turned into, I still think, some quite interesting master plans. And I'm still in touch with the developer occasionally who hired us originally. And what I noticed is that nothing ever was built. It didn't even start. And it basically turned out that our master plans were used to convince other developers, convince the government to build roads, etc. So it became a tool rather than a plan. And they were, I have to say, very respectful of many of the ideas that we had. Perhaps because they saw that it was selling rather than, well, to the government anyways, rather than making a lot of money. And I'm wondering how you, if any of the master plans that you worked on actually got further? Because I know that the system, I discovered later that this system that I describe is quite common in Vietnam and many other places. So I wonder if any of it worked out, and if you have some successful developments that you are really proud of that actually worked out, or if they basically got onto the long line and never really moved on. Thank you.
Well, of course, it's an interesting question, and I think the experience that we've had is similar to yours. A lot of times the master plans, they say yes, 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 it maybe wins a design word here and there, and then it kind of sits on the shelf and the next one comes. Also, as the ministries change, and all of that, it's the same everywhere, unfortunately. But I have to say, for us, what became very nice, because we always work with the local government, or sometimes national government, is that a lot of the principles of what we are working on get taken up. If not the project, but for instance, like the wetro, the water. So this was a project won by, of course, Sasaki, who tends to win everything in Saigon. And the government forced them to take our idea of water transport to put in their plan. So, well, for us, some of our younger colleagues are like, oh, that's not fair, they stole our ideas. Like, be happy, guys. It means the idea is meaning something, and who cares, no? Who's author it? But so for me, in the Mekong Delta regional plan that we made, for me the most successful piece that got realized was that we convinced the Vietnamese government to turn down a project that was by the ADB, that was encouraging them to take a loan that their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would have to pay forever, to build a road in a place that would be flooded, because they never put the flood maps together with the road infrastructure. So we convinced the Ministry of Construction to cancel this mega loan. And so for me, that was a huge win. I mean, when you describe it, it's not a project, it's not a building, but it was a huge, because our local partners, they became such fierce advocates, and they really took possession of the project and fought for it. And to me, that's so even though a lot of the projects do get, say, shelved, and as these master plans go, and that's why I was saying for us, my idea now is I'm hoping to spend much more time in Asia and much more time in Vietnam. And I would really like to work with developers now. So my first experience was a quite horrible one, because there was a preconceived idea of what this architecture should be, and we weren't fitting that. But I think for me now, Vietnam has reached, but they're of course behind China in terms of development, but they've reached a level where there's very good young Vietnamese architects and older Vietnamese architects, but they're catering to a market that is private housing, basically. Not so much even social. The big, say, cultural buildings are still being outsourced to AECOMs and who knows who of the world, OMA and others, no? The big guys, whereas the local guys are remaining, kind of getting marginalized with an elite. And I think the private developers are kind of a new phenomenon in Vietnam. They have a power to change so many people's lives, and they have really crappy architecture and really bad urban planning. So I think, for me, this would be this is where architects, they don't want architects, because architects are too, well, they're in another category. But I think this is the angle in which to try to start to work. And I think that's where China's been very successful, I think, is also, well, at least maybe it's romanticizing from my side, but kind of having development and not all developers, but architects kind of supporting each other in a more constructive way. And Vietnam has, I think, a lot to learn from this in China. Also, I was telling Sam that for me, I'm, again, very inspired by Kong Jianyu for many things, but his letters to the leaders of China, so where he worked so much of his career, also trying to work and understand local leadership and to make changes at that level, convincing the necessity of, not the kind of luxury of design, but the necessity of design. And I think that's something for me where I think Vietnam and Cambodia, absolutely for sure, can learn a lot from the Chinese Hong Kong and mainland experiences, because I think there's a lot to be learned, and you're quite far ahead that like regionally. So instead of the region, because for a long time Vietnam always looked to all the kind of canonical projects they wanted to copy were from the West. And I think we try to always show projects from the region that are much more, well, some more cultural affiliation, but also in terms of the development paradigm, more interesting. So, yeah, kind of around the circle answer to your question, but no, thanks.
Thank you. Due to the time, we can have one more question.
Yeah, Kelly, thank you for a great lecture. And also, because you have worked in Mekong Delta for many, many years, you must travel a lot in Southeast Asia. So I want to invite you to use a very simple sentences to describe the major differences between Pearl River Delta and Mekong Delta, or Mekong Delta and also Ganges Delta of Bangladesh. Thank you.
So, for me, the Mekong Delta and the Ganges, so Bangladesh and Vietnam, and probably because of also national development policies, are a little bit less developed and slower, which is, I think, also an advantage. So they can learn some of the, I don't know if I'd go as far to call them mistakes, but they can learn the good and the bad from what's happened in the Pearl River Delta. Because I think for me what's quite interesting in the little bit I've seen, I don't know the Pearl River Delta, I don't know that well, but the bit I've seen, I think in a certain sense it's been clever, and I think more interesting than the Yangtze River Delta, which I know a little. I think the Pearl River Delta has been doing a decent job, and I think Hong Kong is a great example of this, of kind of respecting the relationship between urbanization and landscape, and not and keeping some of those things separate. I mean, just in Hong Kong, the fact that you haven't let urbanization go wild everywhere is something that the Mekong Delta can learn a lot from, because they don't have this idea that nature needs to be protective or has a value in and of itself. Where I think in the Pearl River Delta, through different cases, that there is a respect that the delta in itself, as a deltaic system, has its own history, but its own power, and that urbanization, if allowed to run wild, will destroy it. So, and the Ganges, I think also, for me, it's also, it's a very difficult case in a sense, because it's hit very hardly, much more severely by so-called natural disasters, which we know are human propelled. So I think the Ganges and the Mekong can learn a lot from the good and the bad. I think for me the linking of these three is a very interesting, would be a fantastic research project. To look at the similarities, but also the differences at the level of the delta, but also at the level of architecture within it. So I think it's a research project waiting to be done. Huh?
Thank you for your questions, and thank you, Professor Shannon.